Part 1. The Awakening of Instinct. Millions of years ago, Earth was a place of raw chaos. The land was untamed, the skies unpredictable, and survival was not a right. It was a daily battle. In this unforgiving world, early hominins emerged not as rulers, but as fragile beings surrounded by predators, storms, and scarcity. They had no weapons, no fire, no language. What they had was instinct, an ancient whisper guiding their every move. The sun rose over savanna teeming with life and death. A small group of early humans stirred from their shelter, a shallow cave carved into a cliffside. Their eyes scanned the horizon, not for beauty, but for danger. The rustle of grass could mean a lion. The silence could mean a trap. Every step outside was a gamble. They moved in silence, communicating only through gestures and glances. Their bodies were lean, hardened by hunger and constant movement. Their hands, though primitive, were beginning to grasp the power of tools. Stones sharpened by accident, sticks used to probe the unknown. Hunting was not yet a skill, it was desperation. They scavenged more than they hunted, following the scent of decay to find carcasses left behind by stronger beasts. But even scavenging was a risk. Competing with hyenas, vultures, and other scavengers meant confrontation, and confrontation meant blood. One wrong move, one misjudged distance, and the cost was fatal. Yet they returned again and again, driven by the need to feed their young, to keep the group alive. Water was another battle. Rivers were home to crocodiles. Stagnant pools bred disease. But thirst was relentless. They learned to watch the animals. Where antelope drank, they followed. Where birds gathered, they dug. Slowly, instinct evolved into observation. Observation into strategy, and strategy into survival. At night, the world changed. The darkness brought cold, fear, and the unknown. Without fire, they huddled together for warmth, their bodies trembling, their ears alert to every sound. The cries of distant predators echoed like thunder. The stars above offered no comfort, only mystery. But in that mystery, something stirred, a spark not a flame but a thought, the beginnings of memory. The first flickers of imagination, and with it, the seeds of resilience. Part 2. The Rise of Struggle. As generations passed, the struggle became ritual. Survival was no longer just instinct. It was tradition. The young learned from the old, not through words, but through repetition. How to grip a stone, how to read the wind, how to run without being seen. These lessons were etched into muscle and bone, passed down like sacred knowledge. The environment shifted. Forests gave way to plains. Herds migrated. Seasons became harsher. And with change came adaptation. Prehistoric humans began to move in larger groups, understanding that unity was strength. Alone, they were prey. Together, they were a force. They began to coordinate hunts, using terrain to trap animals, driving them toward cliffs or into swamps. The first signs of cooperation emerged, not just for food, but for defense. Conflict was not limited to nature. Other groups roamed the land, competing for territory, water, and resources. These encounters were tense, often violent. Stones became weapons. Fire-hardened spears were wielded with trembling hands. The first battles between humans were not for conquest, but for survival. And in those battles, something new was born: leadership. Individuals who could guide, protect, and inspire, not through dominance, but through wisdom and courage. Fire changed everything. Whether discovered by accident or stolen from lightning's wrath, it became the ultimate tool. It brought warmth, protection, and the ability to cook. Cooked food meant stronger bodies, fewer diseases, and more time. Time to think, time to plan, time to dream. Around the fire, stories began. Silent gestures, reenactments of hunts, expressions of fear and triumph. The beginnings of culture. Shelter evolved. Caves were no longer just hiding places. They became homes. Walls were marked with symbols, perhaps warnings, perhaps memories. The landscape bore the traces of human presence. Paths formed. Campsites reappeared. The earth began to remember them. But survival was still brutal. Illness, injury, and famine were constant threats. A broken leg could mean death. A failed hunt could doom a family, yet they endured, not because they were the strongest, but because they were the most adaptable. They learned to listen to the land, to read the skies, to anticipate danger. And in doing so, they carved a place for themselves in a world that had no mercy. Part 3. The Dawn of Humanity. By now, prehistoric humans were no longer just surviving, they were evolving. Their brains expanded, their tools became more refined, and their social bonds deepened. They began to bury their dead, a gesture that hinted at emotion, at belief, at something beyond the physical. The struggle had shaped them, but had also awakened something profound: identity. They began to explore, not just new lands, but new ideas: how to shape stone into blades, how to use fire to harden wood, how to track animals over days. Their minds became maps, their memories libraries. They were no longer reacting. They were anticipating, planning, innovating. Language emerged not as full sentences, but as sounds with meaning, grunts, clicks, and rhythms that conveyed danger, direction, desire. Communication transformed everything. It allowed for teaching, for warning, for dreaming together. And with language came stories. Stories of ancestors, of beasts of the stars. These stories became the glue of tribes, the foundation of identity. Art followed. On cave walls, they painted animals' handprints, symbols, not for survival, but for expression, for connection, for legacy. They began to see themselves not just as part of nature, but as observers of it, as creators within it. The struggle never ended, but it changed. It became a journey, not just to live, but to understand, to shape the world instead of being shaped by it. Prehistoric humans were no longer shadows in the wilderness. They were the beginning of something vast, something unstoppable. The first chapter of a story still being written. And it all began millions of years ago, with fear, with fire, with the will to survive. Part 4. The Edge of Extinction. The climate began to shift. What was once fertile land turned to dust. Rain patterns changed. Herds vanished. The earth itself seemed to rebel against its inhabitants. Prehistoric humans faced not only predators and rival tribes, but now the wrath of nature itself. Droughts scorched the land. Floods swallowed entire valleys. The struggle for survival reached a new level, one that tested not just strength, but ingenuity. Food became scarce. The usual hunting grounds were barren. The fruits that once grew in abundance withered. In desperation, humans began to experiment. They cracked open roots, chewed bitter leaves, and watched animals to learn what was safe. Poison was a constant threat. One wrong bite could mean death. But through trial and error, they built a mental map of edible life. This was the beginning of knowledge, not just instinct, but accumulated wisdom. Migration became necessary. Groups abandoned their ancestral lands in search of safety. They crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and ventured into unknown territories. Each journey was perilous. New predators lurked. New diseases spread. But with each step, they adapted. Their feet toughened. Their lungs adjusted. Their minds sharpened. They began to craft better tools. Axes from stone, containers from bark, even rudimentary clothing from animal hides. Social bonds deepened. In the face of extinction, unity became sacred. Elders were revered for their experience. Children were protected fiercely. Roles emerged: hunters, gatherers, scouts, healers. The tribe became more than a group. It became a system. And within that system, empathy grew. They began to care for the wounded, mourn the dead, and celebrate survival. Emotion was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity. And then came the firestorms. Lightning ignited forests. Smoke choked the skies. Entire ecosystems collapsed. But from the ashes, humans learned to harness fire, not just for warmth, but for transformation. They used it to clear land, to cook new foods, to forge stronger tools. Fire became a symbol, not of destruction, but of rebirth. And with it, they stepped further from the edge of extinction and closer to dominance. Part 5. The Birth of Belief. As survival became more secure, something unexpected emerged: belief. Prehistoric humans began to look beyond the physical. They gazed at the stars not just with curiosity, but with reverence. They saw patterns in nature, omens in the flight of birds, meaning in the shape of bones. The world was no longer just a battlefield. It was a mystery, and mysteries demanded answers. They began to create rituals, dances around the fire, offerings to the moon, burials with care and intention. These acts were not just practical, they were spiritual. They hinted at a belief in something greater, something unseen. Perhaps it was the spirit of the hunt, perhaps the memory of ancestors, perhaps the fear of death itself. But whatever it was, it united them. It gave them purpose beyond survival. Symbols appeared, carvings on wood, marks on stone, patterns in the dust. These were the first languages of the soul. They told stories of battles won, of beasts defeated, of journeys taken. They preserved memory. They taught lessons. They warned of danger. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for culture. Music emerged, not as entertainment, but as expression. Rhythms beaten on logs. Melodies hummed in caves. Sound that echoed emotion, grief, joy, longing. These sounds connected generations. They became part of identity. And with music came art. Paintings of animals. Handprints on walls. Visions of the world as they saw it. And as they dreamed it, belief gave rise to hope. And hope gave rise to ambition. Humans began to imagine a future, not just for themselves, but for their children. They built more permanent shelters. They stored food. They mapped the land. They began to shape their environment, not just react to it. The struggle had evolved into strategy, and strategy into civilization. Part 6, The Legacy of Survival. The prehistoric era was not just a time of hardship. It was the crucible of humanity. Every scar, every triumph, every adaptation became part of a legacy that would echo through millennia. The humans who lived millions of years ago were not primitive. They were pioneers. They faced a world that wanted to erase them, and they carved their existence into its bones. Their tools became relics. Their shelters became ruins. But their spirit endured. It lived on in the fire we still light, in the stories we still tell, in the instincts we still feel, the fear of the dark, the thrill of the hunt, the need to belong. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient inheritances. Their survival shaped our biology. Our minds evolved to anticipate danger, to solve problems, to connect with others. Our bodies adapted to endure, to heal, to protect. Even our emotions, love, grief, pride, were forged in the fires of prehistory. We are not separate from them. We are their continuation. And yet, their world is gone. The beasts they faced are extinct. The landscapes they walked have changed. But their story remains. A story of struggle, of resilience, of transformation. A story that reminds us that humanity was not given. It was earned. Through blood, through fire, through endless nights of fear and hope. Millions of years ago, they fought not just for survival, but for the chance to become something more. And they succeeded. Because today, we remember them, we honor them, and in every heartbeat, every breath, every dream, we carry their legacy forward.